and welcome back to the second edition of Tales from the Heart, a podcast from the HCMA for December 13th, 2024. It's now about 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and we are joined by Professor Elliott, all the way from the other side of the pond in Cheerio, London. I know. I'm not going to try to do your accent, so don't worry about that.
Cheery old London. That's a bit Mary Poppins.
Cheerio, old London. I don't know. I'm trying to like channel my inner Brit, which Jersey and Brit don't probably go along together too well in vernacular. So we are not. This is not Perry's first time joining us on Tales from the Heart. We met over COVID and talked about penetrance of genetics in HCM. And here we are today. And Perry and I, we don't see each other for a long time. And then we show up at all these meetings together. And then I'm like, let's go do a thing. Come to the podcast. So we were together in England at ESC, which was in London this year, and got to catch up and kind of go through the history that we've all been through. So welcome to the podcast. And we're happy to have you. So for history, I got to give the history lesson. The HCMA began its work in 1995-96. A wonderful woman by the name of Carolyn Biro was one of my mentors, and she happened to be one of Perry's patients, and Perry was involved with the efforts in the Cardiomyopathy Association, as it was called back then, with Carolyn. So we kind of met through Carolyn, and she kind of remains this string that ties us together all these years later. So
absolutely.
Props to the Queen. Carolyn, we miss you. I called her the Queen. She called me the Princess. I thought that was always kind of funny. So kind of works.
What do you call you now?
There are other words we use for each other, but I don't think they're podcast sensitive. So I'm going to respectfully decline to answer that one.
Okay.
No, she'd probably call me a badass, is what she'd probably call me today. So here we are all these years later, and so much has happened in HCM. Back then, we were talking about dual-chambered pacing, and maybe it's genetic. We've come a long way, baby. So
we certainly have.
2024 has been kind of a pivotal year in HCM. Things are shifting. Yeah, we've had myosin inhibitors in the United States since 22, but new therapies coming, and the globalization of HCM understanding, I think, is upon us. It's not us versus them. It's what do we all do together, and how do we best manage patients? So from your perspective, what's going on with HCM in Europe and in England and in all the names that you have for your wonderful country?
Yeah, I mean, so in many respects, it's the same as it is in the US. So as you said, we've got this sudden world where we have therapy, new therapies. I've been doing hocomology for almost 30 years, and it's one of my new cliches is I've had more conversations with industry in the past 5 years than I did in the previous 25 years. Reflecting this it's an intense interest in not just new drugs, but gene therapies, different approaches to gene therapy. Not all of this stuff's going to work, but there's a lot of effort to try to manage this disease in new ways. So it really is a new era for the disease. I think, at least I would say, for us in Europe, North America. But I think what's also going to happen, particularly as we start to develop some of these new, exciting, expensive therapies, that it's going to start shining a light on areas of the world where there's HOCM is present in just as frequent, does the same things, causes the same burden of disease, but where access to some of the new therapies is going to be a little bit challenging. So I think we're going to have a debate about prioritization, about how we identify cases, what it means in different healthcare settings. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, you used the word global or globalization. Well, globalization is challenging, but I do think we have a responsibility to think about how this all pans out in different parts of the world now.
I had a A father reached out to me from Pakistan earlier this year, and he had a child. Unfortunately, the child did not survive, but they couldn't even get beta blockers in his part of the world.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
here we're talking about advanced therapeutics when in some parts of the world, we don't even have infrastructure to get a basic beta blocker to a 4-year-old in need. So, globalization is going to be complicated. I think we can do better. I think we have to do better. And I think this is our window of time because we have
Yeah.
industry interested, and they are going to also have a responsibility to these underserved communities to provide at least basic care, if not the cutting edge, at least something so that we can eliminate suffering as best as possible. So
Absolutely. I mean, we have industry interested, but I think we also have organizations like WHO and so on, not so much about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy yet, but certainly around the challenges, but also the opportunities, for example, around genomic medicine. WHO have put huge emphasis on particularly the global COVID response. There's been quite a focus on cancer because cancer are way ahead of us in cardiovascular medicine in terms of the application of genetics, genomics in everyday practice. There's also huge possibilities around genomics in relation to infection, et cetera, But I think what hasn't happened quite yet on a global scale is the advocacy for cardiovascular disease generally, but also more specifically for perhaps the commonest cardiovascular genetic conditions, cardiomyopathies.
So I have been working for the past, couple of years on how to develop advocacy in other countries. I mean, you've got a great
Mm.
organization doing great work there, but other countries don't have those voices. They don't have that organization. So I we're working closely with Sweden, and you met one of them in DC. They came over here.
Mm.
One of the representatives. We're working in Brazil and Australia and um, India and other countries to try to get the patient advocacy voice elevated. And if we start the patient advocacy voices being elevated and we get industry interested, we find our KOLs, we can develop a network that patients become safer because of. And that's
Absolutely.
that's a big challenge.
It's a challenge, but again, there are opportunities. It's just like the drug development. I think we have reached this tipping point, the recognition that the global burden of cardiovascular disease remains very high. 1 in 4 of us or more will die from cardiovascular disease. Despite all of the success over the past 20, 30, 40 years, it's still a major cause for death in both developed and so-called developing countries. That's being recognised. So, I mean, you've been working with World Heart Federation. The ESC has a global perspective on this, and the EU literally 3-4 days ago published its intention to create a cardiac plan for Europe in the same way as they have done for cancer. So I think there is collaboration at government level, there's collaboration at medical level, collaboration between patient organizations. I mean, you do a lot of work with many of these kind of umbrella organizations, Global Heart Hub and so on. There are opportunities across the piece. I think we just have to make sure that we work together, try to, as much as we possibly can, avoid duplication of effort, so that we actually synergize rather than compete. But you said, go back to when we were sitting around Caroline's table 20, 30 years ago. It's a very, very different landscape now.
It is. It seems like a minute and a lifetime ago in the same breath, right?
Yeah.
We were
Yeah.
talking about very, very basic stuff back then when you look to what we're doing now, which is pretty amazing, that we've come so far in that shorter period of time. And I do believe that it's been the partnerships that we've all created and the collaborations that have moved it forward. Not that there hasn't been some opportunities for lively debate and conversation, and they've been fun too, and we've all learned something from them. But here we are in a day and time, and you brought up 2 excellent organizations, one being the Global Heart Hub, of which we are a founding member of the Cardiomyopathy Council, and we've done some good work to get the wheels on the train there, and it's really starting to move now. Super proud of all of our partners in the Global Heart Hub. That's one. And this is going to be my public announcement that the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association has become an affiliate member of the World Heart Federation. And we are seeking to get more involved with their efforts and see what we can do with that platform and those individuals to help raise awareness of HCM and all thick heart muscle disorders worldwide. So it doesn't happen in a bubble. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens with conversation. It happens with collaboration. And there is so much more we can do when we join together and we can really advance not only the science, but the application of the science in the real world with all the real world problems that we're all dealing with. So
Absolutely.
it's a time of change. So let's talk about the recent past, the past year. There's been a lot going on. You've been very busy on ESC TV all the time. I see Perry there doing his very professional moderation all the time. And I laugh and I'm like, I knew him when. So what's the hot topics in ESC and in the global look at HCM, and what do you think are the highlights of 24?
So I think, well, in terms of cardiomyopathy, it's been very much around new therapies, trials. I mean, God, trials in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, drug trials, placebo-controlled trials. I mean, that for me has been the huge change over the past couple of years, and that we've got randomized trials now of new agents, the myosin inhibitors in particular, but there's other stuff as well going on. People trying other drugs, repurposing other drugs, but the myosin inhibitors have clearly been a major step forwards. As you know, I'm not a person given to hyperbole, and I think
Not at all. Not at all.
I think the words game changer did pass my lips briefly, but they are the first new therapy we've had in decades. We've been using the same old 3 or 4 drugs, and I think as I said at the meeting we were recently at in DC, I don't think it's not exactly we've been lying to ourselves and to our patients, but we only had a limited number of options, basically, for the management of, particularly of symptoms in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, beta blockers, calcium antagonists, disopyramide. And we all knew, patients, physicians knew that sometimes, you could get really good therapeutic response, but most of the time it's, a bit, I'm felt maybe a little better, but I've got side effects and, this ain't much fun. So this is a big step forwards from that. It's not a panacea, and I'm very careful before putting patients on the new drug to say, look, I'm suggesting this because I think there's a good chance you're going to be a lot better in terms of your symptoms, but it's whatever 30-40% of people in the trial responded, at least achieved the primary endpoint, which was a tough primary endpoint, I must say. To not only feel better, but do better on a cardiopulmonary exercise test. I mean, you won't find that in heart failure trials because it's such a damn difficult thing to achieve. So, significant endpoints in both Sequoia and Explorer. But like everything HOCM, it's heterogeneous. So we're going to have people who respond, people who don't. What we're seeing, though, I think, is we're putting people on these drugs. And for the first time in years, they're saying, do you know what? This is the one that makes a difference. I'm on even at the starting dose. I want to stay on this because I feel really different now. So, and that's a kind of response I only really see after surgery, after septal myectomy or occasionally after alcohol ablation. But you get rid of the gradient and the patient feels a lot better. Well, we're doing that pharmacologically now in a big bunch of people. So that I think has been the biggest step forward.
I remain optimistic about the deployment of these medications to the public, but there's some challenges, and these are spaces that I never had to deal with before because, we were all generic drugs. There was no real question about, like, disopyramide was the expensive drug, like Norpace CR was the expensive one, and that's pennies in comparison to what we're doing with the newer drugs. And globally, we all know that drug prices are a problem, and we have to find a way to be able to get discovery accomplished, credit those people, and we do that in business by giving them money for doing what they did. It's profits. So we have to encourage industry to build us new drugs. We have to pay for those drugs. How do we get there? In every country, it's a different mechanism to get a drug approved and then to get it paid for. So you think approval is the really hard part, but it's not. It's the getting it paid for part. So do you have any words of wisdom from a socialized medicine standpoint of how we can do a better job of getting high cost drugs to the real patients that need them?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think about a lot, because we've not had really this problem in cardiovascular medicine before. In stark contrast, for example, with oncology. I mean, we use a lot of very expensive drugs in oncology. But there is a difference. There is a difference between cancer and cardiovascular. So in cancer, if you don't treat it, you're going to die within a fairly limited time frame. You could argue the same is true of cardiovascular disease, but of course we're not, even with the excitement around myosin inhibitors, these are not drugs that we currently know to alter the natural history of this disease. So this is a purely symptomatic therapy. So we're comparing apples and oranges in terms of the advocacy point, if you will, about well, why are we spending money in cancer and not in cardiovascular? Well, they are different in that respect. I think we have a cultural problem in cardiovascular medicine.
Yes.
I mean, it's not just payers. It's not just the NICE or the National Health Service that are saying, "Oh, this is an expensive drug." It's my colleagues that are saying this is an expensive drug. Oh, why are we using that? That's very expensive. That sounds very expensive. ACE inhibitors are not that expensive. And it's again because we haven't been in that space before. We have new approaches to drugs which potentially are disease modifying, where we should be the primary advocates for this. But actually, I think my colleagues are still trying to get their head around this. And this is a thin end of a wedge. There's other stuff coming down the line now. So we're going to have to think a little differently, I think, as a cardiovascular community, as cardiac specialists. With our own approach to this, we've had some sort of, I would say, to some extent, somewhat contradictory decisions.
Exactly.
So tafamidis, for amyloidosis struggled. The price point is very similar, or at least the list price was very similar. Whereas actually mavacamten didn't really touch the sides. I mean, that went through pretty easily. So what was the difference? What was the difference between those two drugs? And there's maybe because we have negotiated prices that we're obviously not in the public domain, so maybe that was part of it. But I think, again, this is an advocacy point. Amyloidosis affects elderly, frail people without a voice. Whereas hypertrophic cardiomyopathy affects younger people. It affects a full spectrum, but it affects younger people who are working, who have a voice of their own, have people like you and the other organizations to represent them. People with amyloid don't have that. So is it 10% of the reason it got approved or 9% of the reason? I don't know. But I think the advocacy is really important. Even in a social healthcare system like ours, it's really, really important in getting it over the line. And I think that possibly helped a bit with mavacamten, just the perception of the drug.
I think it did. I think we were organized. And I think that helped.
Yeah.
So you brought up one of our thick-hearted friends, which is amyloid. So as we are talking about price, a lot of these conditions have a genetic component, and they're not all treated the same way. So Fabry's disease, which I know you've worked in many, many years, has its own therapy, but it can look a lot like HCM on an image. Amyloid, same thing, has its own very specific treatment pathway, looks like HCM on imaging, so you got to go deeper. So we are in this really amazing cross of understanding of human genetics, understanding different disease states at a deeper level. It's not what you see on the surface, it's what's in the genes that matter. So we're at this moment where we're taking genetic information and we're helping it guide therapy in a very precise way so that not only do we treat that individual properly, we can treat their families appropriately and maybe get in front of disease states. And I mentioned two, but there are others. Sarcoidosis can look like HCM on imaging, Danon disease, RASopathies. There's all of these other things that can make the heart sick, and they're all going to get targeted therapies. It's going to be the Wild West of data and approaches and therapeutics. How are we going to do it all? We're getting old. How are we going to do this all?
So I think we've been doing that for quite a while. So this is what my colleague, sadly deceased now, Claudia Rapezzi, called the cardiomyopathy mindset, which is actually not specific to cardiomyopathy, but it was the way I was taught medicine. So, when you're making diagnosis, it's an iterative process. So someone presents within a context, they're young, they're old, they're a sportsman or they have occupational exposure. You take a history, you do some tests, you try to interpret those, you then decide the need for specialized testing, and you go back and over this till you get as close as you can to the underlying diagnosis. In the land of cardiomyopathy, whether we're talking about hypertrophic or dilated, it's always been heterogeneous in terms of etiology. The why question, as I teach, if someone presents with a thick heart, when we use that label, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that's the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. That you have to say, why is this heart thick? Or why is this heart dilated? Why have they got this pattern of scar? Or why? You should be like an annoying child. Because it's only by asking that question that, as you say, you reveal the other conditions, or the many conditions which look like a thick heart when you do an echo. I think the reason it's taken a while to get traction, this idea, is I think it's something peculiar to cardiovascular medicine. There's the so what. Yeah, we're a bit. I know I don't want to insult my surgical colleagues, but cardiologists are a bit surgical in their thinking. Tell me when it makes a difference. And the response to that has largely been from characters like myself and other people who do inherited cardiovascular disease. Well, as you said, family, advice to the family, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But I'm a cardiologist. I don't do families. I don't do genetics. I don't do all that kind of stuff. That's not my beef. When you get therapy, it changes everything, because now suddenly there's an incentive. At least in their mind, I would say there's always been an incentive, but you get the sudden accentuation of that interest. Amyloidosis is the poster child for this. It's always been there.
Yep.
I mean, we agreed before we went on, went live, not to talk about HFpEF. My bête noire. I hate the term HFpEF. But we've been doing HFpEF trials for yonks, and many of the people in those trials have had amyloidosis.
And HCM.
They've not been and HCM, absolutely. I mean, the images you see, you hardly ever see images from people who have PEP trials, but when you do see them, it's either HCM or it's amyloidosis. But
exactly.
It didn't, blah, 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 it's in there. It might still respond to an ARB or something, but suddenly, 10, 15% of these people might have amyloidosis. We better put them to one side and treat them, because we've now got specific treatments for those people. And those treatments are making a difference. They're making a big difference. So suddenly everybody's interested in amyloidosis. With the myosin inhibitors, everybody's interested in outflow tract obstruction. Everybody's interested in HCM. Everybody, right? I mean, you must be seeing this as a charity. I mean, it's the number of people who are curious, want to get into this space, which is a good thing. You've got a whole new generation of new doctors, healthcare professionals who want to get into the cardiomyopathy space. That's great. But what's driving it? a lot of it is the fact that we've got these amazing new therapies.
So let's just talk for a minute about, a new therapy. So this had to be a scientific finding. We had to understand the cardiac sarcomere. We had to figure out what powered the sarcomere, and we had to figure out how to alter that functioning. So this
Yeah,
is not like, oh, we found a mushroom that has an agent in it that we think works. No, we had to figure out where the target was and figure out how to get to the target. And this took a lot of time, energy,
yep,
bench science, animal studies. Like it went through the whole thing. And we're behind the scenes watching this happen, helping it develop. But we have a mechanism of action which we never really treated before in HCM. Some could argue that, by cutting out tissue and changing the outflow tract's anatomy, it's as close as you can get to this. But we're going deeper. We're going into the muscle. We're not just
mm,
changing gradient. Can you talk a little bit more about what we're doing to the actual muscle with these new agents in HCM? And we'll kind of go back to some of these spectrum disorders in a bit. But why is it so important to understand that it's not just another beta blocker?
yeah. So I'll just preface this by just saying that to pick up on your point that it took so long. Late 1980s, first gene for
Yeah.
hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And why do we have this now? Well, it reflects that it takes that long to understand the science, to develop a drug, and take that idea, that spark in someone's brain to actually get it into a product, into into real life. It also reflects, again, the research allocation of research funding, the number of people doing it. It also reflects the dialogue or lack of dialogue, I would argue, between different stakeholders, between the
Yes.
scientists and the clinicians and industry and patients. What is it the patients want? Because even now, our culture is still, we're designing this trial and we'll come up with this amazing endpoint, and that's the one that's important to patients. Well, it probably is, but are you sure? Are you sure that's the right thing to target? So I think the world around drug development and so on is changing. We also have the technologies now that we didn't have back in early
Absolutely.
1990s for gene therapy and for doing all this kind of stuff in a dish as well as in man. So I think, again, it's part of this golden era. But I just make the point in that I think the dialogue between the different stakeholders in therapeutic development needs to continually improve so that we don't waste our time or do things that people don't want.
So
Um,
I'm gonna reflect upon history for a bit
mm,
because
okay.
systems change. It changes on your side and it changes on my side. So let's go back to the late 90s. How did the flow from a patient to discovery actually happen? Well, I'm going to use an example, and his name is well, I won't do the name here, but it's a young man who had a very thick heart. He's kind of known now. So his name's Jeremy. We'll talk about Jeremy. I'll go that way because it's fully disclosed. Um, Jeremy had a thick heart. Jeremy's dad freaked out by the diagnosis of possible hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Found us in the late 90s on a really bad website that had really bad images. And I'm sorry to anybody who had to look at it. It's much better now. So dad called me. I looked at everything and said, this, from an advocacy point of view, looks a little unusual for this age and this presentation. I'm going to highly recommend you go to a specialist. So at that point, he went from Delaware to Minneapolis, saw Barry. Barry said, this is weird. So Barry calls Cricket and says, I think this is something else genetically. So we get the blood. Barry's doing the workup, and he turns out to be one of the early LAMP2 diagnoses.
Yeah.
And the science moves slowly, but the science moves. So in that spectrum disorder, which is Danon disease, which nobody knew about, it's ultra rare. And I got to learn about it by this patient and this entire situation, but it was the relationships and the partnerships. Barry said, this is genes. It's weird. It's not HCM. It's something else. Blood goes over to the Seidman lab. Cricket looks at it, comes up with LAMP2. And that was around 1999, 2000. And in 2019, 2020, Rocket Pharmaceutical said, we have a gene therapy for that disease. And I'm now working with
Exactly.
that company. But that took all that time, but it started kind of like with 1 or 2 patients. This is interesting. There's probably more. Let's dig deeper. Let's dig deeper. And Jeremy Acosta, his heart was retained after he passed away. And he didn't make it to transplant. He died in 2007. And we actually talked to the family and said, do you want to donate his heart to science? His heart went to Bill Roberts. Bill Roberts did the path work on it, wrote an article with Barry. It turned out to be the world's largest heart. But the story doesn't end there. Bill passed away last year. Miss him, great guy. But his lab closed. And they called me and said, do you want the heart back? I said, yes, I want the heart back. So the heart was now plastinized. And it made its appearance at the American Heart Association this year, where this was kind of an amazing moment. The phase 1 data from the Dannon's trial was read out, and Eric Adler took Jeremy's heart with him on stage as he presented the data to make it full
Nice.
circle. And maybe some other people in the room didn't understand the moment as much as I did, because I watched it come full circle and it took 25 years to do it. But what hope, what promise for the future.
Absolutely.
And how do you take the advocacy, the science, the industry, and you put them all together? Well, Rocket's doing it in Dannon, and we're probably going to do it in HCM in other ways too, maybe with multiple different techniques for gene therapy. But it takes a village, and a global village at that.
It does, yeah. And yeah, so many points in what you just said. I mean, but I come back to this culture thing. I mean, I think I said it at the meeting in DC. Before I came to DC, I was at a meeting in Belgium, in Antwerp, and it was we formed pre-COVID, I think, a ESC Council on Cardiovascular Genomics to act as a catalyst for bringing together different strands of interest within cardiovascular medicine. Now, this is ESC Council. Often don't get huge attendances, shall we say? But this was our first in-person meeting. We've done online meetings before. It was oversubscribed, and what I was struck by was the number of young cardiologists who, with an interest and a passion in this whole field. It's the why question. It's the manifestation of the why question. This is really interesting because they're not embarrassed about saying, it's a really thick heart. I wonder what the gene is. I wonder if that could be Dannon's disease. Whereas if you're a cardiologist of a certain era, you would have thought, what's that? Why should I be bothered with that? Let's do the angioplasty, get on with it. That's cardiology. So there's a whole change which has happened, which I think is going to means the next time around with the next rare disease, and there's a long list of rare diseases, I think this development is going to be quicker. So I think
we can also look at each of the gene mutations in HCM as kind of their own micro diseases within the diseases.
Yeah. So you could potentially, treat n equals 1 now. It's a possibility. So there's a little way to go there, but that's going to happen very quickly. Whether it happens with gene replacement, we'll see. But there are approaches where you could actually start to do bespoke therapies for just that individual. That's incredible.
Well, when you're looking at gene therapies, and if you have a PSK9 mutation and you have an HCM mutation, can we concoct a customized treatment to address both of those problems simultaneously? And from there,
slow down.
From there, you're off to the races, right? So
slow down. Yeah, but it's an interesting point. Combination therapies. Combination therapies are going to go to the health planning and the money thing. So we're going to have a wave of new expensive therapies coming through. Mava and Afi are only the beginning, and it's going to get probably progressively more expensive. We start getting gene therapies. We can already start to see some of the dilemmas. We've actually had this dilemma before with Fabry's disease. Uncommon, less than 1% of HCM. But the logic has always been to use combination therapies at different points in the metabolic pathway. Well, in amyloid, we've already got that. Why not give a stabilizer and maybe a drug to get rid of the amyloid? That's probably going to become a reality quite soon. Now, if they're both quite expensive, can we afford that? And this is where the societal element comes in, because if the pace of change is what we've been raving about, there are going to come moments when we have to collectively say, can we afford this? Because we're talking about cardiovascular, it could be oncology, it could be respiratory medicine, it could be renal medicine, because the genetic revolution is not just in cardiovascular medicine.
Mm-mm.
So there are some significant societal questions that we're going to have to start facing and discussing, and be very open about choices that have to be made in healthcare. So that's a sort of slight shadow on the excitement, but I think it's something we need to start thinking about and preparing for.
Oh, we were thinking about those problems every
I'm
day,
sure.
and how, like, where are the prices going? What are the payers thinking? And, the US healthcare system, I don't know if you heard or not, but it's a little broken. It's a little wonky. We get some good things, we get some bad things, but I think everybody right now is struggling to just keep up with patient volume and keep those clinic appointments and get enough docs in to see the patients. So it's a service model, you're going to a practitioner for a service, but the wait lists are very long all over the world now. And I don't want to hear people tell me,
Absolutely.
oh, well, socialized medicine has longer wait lists than your for-profit model. We got 6 to 8 month waits for a lot of things in the United States now. It took me like 5 months to get into a gastroenterologist this year. Like 5 months I waited. And
That sounds like the NHS. What you
it
doing?
sounds like the NHS. But I also get to pay a lot of money for it. So I get to wait and pay money rather than just wait and get it done. So I don't think we're not doing a good job at managing the healthcare system in this country, as evident by recent happenings in the United States. Um, that's not the answer. I so wish that young man used his intellect to solve problems in a more meaningful way. But we're in a palpably angry state over here. And I know that other healthcare systems are struggling as well. And how do
They
we
all are,
make
I
the
think.
change? Yeah.
Yeah, they all are.
We have more
It's
people,
health, aging
more diseases.
population. Yeah,
Ages.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm not aging.
Yeah, no,
Are you aging?
I came out of the womb at the age of 50. I mean, I haven't really changed very much. So.
I think you did. I'm
I
gonna
think
go
I
45.
did.
I'm gonna be 45. And you're just kind of stuck there. Yeah. I was doing some math this morning. I was talking to Marty, and I realized that Marty is now the age Barry was when I met Barry. That hurt.
There we are.
Because Marty was a college student at that time. But that's a whole other story about how
Yeah.
things move and change. So gene therapy, targeted therapies, expensive therapies, but such meaningful improvements. I'm not a fan of certain words to be used for how somebody feels, but when multiple people have told me that the way they feel on a myosin inhibitor is a miracle, that they didn't think they'd get this quality of life back, that's game changing. That is,
Absolutely.
just reframing the entire question. And I wanted to say that in our Voice of the Patient report to the FDA, we were very clear about what the patients wanted. And I'm going to tell you that the asks were not like, I want to run a marathon. The asks were, I'd like to walk and breathe simultaneously, which I don't
Exactly.
think is a very high bar.
No.
It wasn't.
And it's not one that's captured by most quality of life questionnaires, isn't it? But it's, I mean, you know very, very well. I mean, people have lived with their condition usually for many, many years, and they've adapted to it. But that adaptation means exactly what you say. So, it means that I don't go upstairs, or there's a ton of things I avoid doing. Or if I've now got a family of my own, I know that if I'm going to play with the kids, I'm going to have to sort of build that. I'm going to have to plan for that, because I know I'm going to be completely destroyed if I do that the next day. So that's the kind of thing that I think if you're good at what your job and you speak to people, you understand the impact of disease as much as you can if you don't have it yourself. That hasn't until very recently, I think, been factored into trial design. I think this is something else. I maybe sort of maybe making too much of a claim for cardiomyopathy, but I think you're seeing the convergence of two types of world. So cardiomyopathy was all about diagnosis and mulling over rare things and detail, but we'd had no treatments. And heart failure world, which is all about ejection fraction, 10,000 patients in a trial, reduction in relative mortality, blah, blah, blah. Bringing those two things together. And the interface, I think, has been about the importance, the new importance of patient-reported outcomes of the feel and function notion within a trial, and recognizing that is just as valid, in fact, in some circumstances, more valid and more important to patients than a mortality endpoint, which is, again, what we've been obsessed by. Certainly it's been a focus in cardiovascular disease. I mean, in a heart failure trial, not to diminish, as I say, the huge impact that the drugs have had, but if you actually look for evidence of improvement in quality of life, it ain't there. What we focus on is stopping people coming into hospital with recurrent heart failure, which is important, maybe making them live a bit longer, which can be important. But can I get up the stairs? Can I do more things? A lot of the therapies that we throw around in the clinic can make an assumption that people skip out feeling amazing on their 4 pillars. It's not true. So that's why I think cardiomyopathies, the focus is necessarily on feel and function. Because whilst we know that our HOCM and other cardiomyopathies do have an impact on longevity, they do increase the risk of sudden death, they do increase the risk of developing aggressive heart failure and stroke. It takes place over a time frame which is difficult to design into a trial. Whereas the feel and function endpoints are something which is immediate and now. And that, we started with obstruction in HCM. It's a good place to start, but it's going to be maybe a little bit more difficult in non-obstructive HCM. It may be, if you're going to take people with milder disease, what are you going to be able to measure if you use a new drug? All that stuff, But these are good challenges to have. We haven't had these challenges before because we didn't have drugs which might change them.
We have not, which is why we took last October. We had a meeting. I got to publish my report. It's a little late, but I'm getting it out there. We held a clinical trial endpoints meeting. We asked a bunch of really smart people who were in the trial world, like, what do we need to do to create better clinical trial endpoints for HCM? And from what you learned from us, what can you use to help others? And we came out that the measures aren't specific to us. Things like New York Heart Association class don't really work for us because we have good days, bad days, average days. So how do you measure and who's deciding what class you are? So that's a challenge. And KCCQ is kind of the standard, but it doesn't really speak to HCM in a specific way. So what do? I called John Spertus, who wrote KCCQ, and I'm like, let's make one just for HCM. So guess what's happening right now? That's being developed. Sure. And we could have another more specific model. Is that the end all be all? Probably not, but it's an improvement, and maybe somebody else will improve on that later. But we're already working with 2 new trials that are coming up that are going to use our KCCQ HCM as an experimental endpoint. And we're going to hopefully learn a little bit more about how to capture that patient experience more articulately and more specifically. I use a baseball analogy. I don't know much about cricket or soccer or football, so I can't do those. So
baseball. What's baseball?
I know, baseball. So if I ask an HCM doc like yourself for a baseball analogy of how well are you doing deploying all the tools that you have to treat these patients and how well can you possibly get to, you're on third base heading for home. And you're like, we got this. But when you ask the patient, they kind of feel like maybe they're up at bat or maybe they got to first base and they still have a long way to go. But that's just because you don't have a lot of tools left to deploy for them. But we're getting more tools. So hopefully the patient who thinks they're on first base and the doctor who thinks they're on third base, maybe we can come to a realization that we're actually on second. And we're going to start from there. But shared understanding of what symptoms are from the patient perspective, because we lie. We don't mean to lie, but we feel okay and we don't like to complain. So we're no worse than we were the last time I saw you, which wasn't very good to begin with. But we don't want to complain and we don't want to be seen as weak. We want to be stoic and strong and good little warrior patients. So admitting that we have weaknesses or we can't do is hard. So we're balancing normal life. And like you use the analogy, do I have the energy to play with the kids? And if I do, what's the outcome going to be? What else can't I do? And
Mm.
people without HCM or without chronic disease don't have to make those decisions of how am I going to spend my energy today. They're just going to have a day, go to sleep, get more energy, do it again. We can't do that. We have this
Mm.
rebound effect from too much activity that's very hard to quantify. It's almost impossible to document for clinical trial purposes. But what I'm hoping is we can get to a point of an endpoint could be stabilization of New York Heart Association class, things like that.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, NYHA class gets a rough rap. Really, I don't mind it so much. I mean, it's used. People criticize it a huge amount, but it always ends up in trials. And I think the problem with it was twofold. I think one is its lack of granularity. You've got 4 numbers to which you can describe people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one problem. The second is that if you just read the descriptions of each class, it's pretty useless. But if you use it in an intelligent way, or if you ask all the questions we've been discussing, 1 and 3 is pretty easy. Look, start asking me these questions. I'm okay. I have no symptoms whatsoever. I can do everything that you want me to do. 1, genuinely asymptomatic.
True one.
3,
Very rare, but true.
True one.
Yeah.
It's in hokum.
Yeah.
The 3s, I can't go up a single flight of stairs. I could. This is the subjectivity, but I think if you can't get up a single flight of stairs, or you've got to stop twice, or if you've got a bit of orthopnea, that's a 3 for me. Not 4 for me is in the hospital in heart failure. 2 is a bit broad, and so that's where a lot of people get lost in the 2s. When you get a big change, it's meaningful, and that's what we saw in Explorer and Sequoia. So you had people who were at least class 2, so they were symptomatic, but they were going into class 1. They were reporting, I have no symptoms now, thank you very much. It's that, as you say, that game changer moment where I don't have to think about going up the stairs anymore. I don't have to think about going down the shops. They've become class 1. So the magnitude of the change, if you've got something that really works in an individual, I think NYHA class is absolutely fine. Where it gets a bit fuzzy is at a population level. You're taking a group of people. Actually, that's another thing. And John Spertus, amongst others, has sort of promoted this idea. When we do trials, we look at average responses.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get a big average response, that's a success. And of course, at one level, it is.
It is.
But again, the dark truth is that within the noise, you've got some people who are doing amazingly well. You've got other people who are not really benefiting at all. Could there be people who are not benefiting but actually getting worse? And this is a concept again, which is is out there in oncology. It's one of the major drivers for personalized medicine. Can you define the responders and the non-responders? And if you've got non-responders, why are they not responding? Because they're the ones who've got to focus on now. Why is this amazing game-changing drug or intervention or surgery, whatever it is, why is it not working in that person? Is the disease too advanced? Is the anatomy not right? Have they got a different disease altogether? So I think this notion of breaking up responses, which there's always put 10 cardiologists in the room. What do you mean by a response? But I think in cardiomyopathy trials we can do that now. I think if you're looking at quantitative approaches to feel and function, I think we can start looking at individual responses and trying to work out why it is people do and don't respond to an intervention.
I think that is going to be the holy grail of the treatments coming forward. What can we learn in 2025? We've had people on myosin inhibitors now going on almost 6 years from the early trial participants, maybe even 7 years, some of them in the early trial participants. So what is happening to those who are responding? There's reports that EKGs are normalizing. Oh my God. How'd you do that with a pill? So who are they? Who's the one that
Yeah.
can get all the way to the point of normalizing your ECG and you, for all intents and purposes, don't look like you have HCM anymore? But stop the drug, and what happens? Is it going to just go back to
Yeah.
where it was, or have we modified the actual progression of disease? So, super cool information there. And looking at future trial design, which you and I just spent our whole week talking about clinical trial designs and what do we need to do. You missed an interesting session on the last day. It was mostly patients on the panel. Unfortunately, it was the least populated session that I attended. Um, but they were talking about where do patients belong in the clinical trial process when it comes to creating the protocols. Now, HCMA has worked with multiple companies over the years to help either in an advisory board or a review process on their clinical trials and giving them feedback from the documents to the frequency of appointments to the endpoints. So we've been at the table for these conversations and we're lucky to be there and we're grateful to be there. But what if we're not there? Who's deciding what the patient wants? And sometimes the thoughts are quite
Yeah.
off on that. So one of the physicians who was chairing the session said, well, I don't think patients really belong on data safety monitoring boards because what do they know? To which I kind of,
He said that.
yeah, he did. He actually said
Okay.
that. He said that.
Okay.
And most of the patients on the panel kind of like leaned forward and looked at him like, what? We belong there too. So I got up to the mic and I said, the patient sitting right next to you on this very panel happens to be a physician who also has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and has the mental capacity and the understanding to be able to look at this data in a highly analytic way. Does every patient belong on a DSMB? No, no.
No.
But low health literacy patients and patients from previously underserved communities, they belong in different capacities on these panels to make sure that we're making sense to them, to make sure their voice is being captured. And maybe a patient who happens to have some scientific background might do well on a DSMB. But patients are everywhere. We're in every walk of life. We're in, elected positions. We're running businesses. We might even run advocacy organizations. We've been there, we've done that.
God.
No, it's weird. So I think we need to be open. And the FDA opened a program a couple of years ago called TAP, and it's for device discovery. And they connect patient organizations with new industry members and make sure that the industry and the patient community are connected at the start of the discovery process and the submission process to the FDA. We are part of that program. So we need to be at the table at every level from start to finish and beyond. And when we're looking at clinical trials, we need to be thinking about real world deployment simultaneously. There you go.
You know, as you're talking, I'm getting flashbacks. We started off by talking about Carolyn, right? Carolyn Biro.
Yep.
And so it wouldn't happen now, unfortunately, I don't think. But Bill McKenna, who was my boss at the time, 1993, spotty young research fellow, we were asked to go and present at the Cardiomyopathy Association meetings, and I've been doing it ever since then. What did that teach me? It taught me that actually, patients are people, just like doctors are people, and there's a range of intelligence and knowledge and interest, as much in cardiologists as there is amongst people, but most people are, pretty smart, and they can smell, the proverbial from a mile off. So what it taught me was just be open and honest and talk to people as if they're human beings and listen. And if you do that, I mean, I see over the years, I've seen colleagues who've been very frightened about walking to that kind of forum. You're in a hotel somewhere and you've got a room full of patients and carers and so on. Oh my, and we're suddenly stripped of all the defenses that we have, right? In a clinic, and clinic, you're in the power seat, you've got your nurses outside, all that kind of stuff. But in that kind of room, you're exposed, but you're not really exposed if you just speak to people as if they're people and listen. And I think that's as important in terms of advocacy or just information, but it's also, I think, increasingly important in the things that we choose to invest in, including the design of clinical trials.
So Carolyn and I had some deep talks early on, like, how do you do this? And how do we get the clinician community and the patient community to come together so that we can start moving forward together? And we discussed a very simple concept of humanizing each other and bringing us to the table as equals. You know things that we don't know, we know things that you don't know. And the first 2 or 3 meetings I had, Carolyn was at my very first meeting in 1997, I think it was. And I invited, 5 or 6 docs to talk because, like, that's all I really knew at the time. But one of them was Barry, and he showed up. To his credit, he came in early. There was like 60 people in the room, if that. But what he did during that first meeting let me know we were onto something. His notepad was flying. The questions coming from the audience, the different aspects of how people were asking about what. Notes. And every year after that meeting, about 8 months later, a really unique paper would be published. And I would know that the nidus point of that question and that part of his brain that opened up was because Susie asked a question, or Susie asked him why he didn't know something. That was fun. Like, why don't you know? And he's like, well, now I have to go find out. And within a year, he had the answers. And it worked beautifully. And then the meeting grew and grew and grew. And the patient interaction, I just was talking to Marty about this in the last podcast. The sessions were great, but the time hanging out at the bar or the barbecue or the gala or whatever, to get to know each other as human beings and understand how much we have in common and how we have this shared focus, it built the soul of the community and the connection. And it reminds the physicians, as I am told, why they actually got into this to begin with. It's to help real people. And it lets the people know that these people who are treating them as clinicians are shared in the mission, that they are invested in the success of that patient. So I think it's kind of beautiful. I think we built something kind of unique. I think we can be proud about that. So in our last minute, what's the biggest thing you're looking forward to in 2025?
Oh my goodness gracious! In the HCM space. So I suppose we've talked a lot about the trials in obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'm looking forward to seeing the data in non-obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, because I also think that has ramifications beyond HCM in its purest form. I mean, I didn't answer your question earlier about how these drugs work, but you're looking at drugs. The headline in obstructive disease is reducing contractility and reducing the outflow tract gradient, but that's not where the action is. The action's in how the heart relaxes, how you reduce the energy that it requires. And that's a really tough nut to crack. But I think, again, we're seeing therapeutic developments by a number of different companies, different approaches, where if we can crack that one, that could be pretty amazing for HCM and actually many, many other heart muscle disorders, perhaps even HFpEF, whatever that is.
So we teased a couple times about HFpEF. So HFpEF, I'm going to go on a small rant. About 2 years ago, I was invited to a meeting on HCM and HFpEF drug discovery. And I sat in the room and I listened to representatives from 4 different companies explain what HFpEF was, and none of them used the same definition. And therein, I'm like, oh, so the problem first is, what is it? Is it a combination of hypertension, obesity, and diabetes? Do you need 2 out of the 3 to get HFpEF? Is 1 enough to get HFpEF? Is it multi-genetic? Is it polygenetic? So we don't quite know the what, but we know that HFpEF can look like HCM and act like HCM, and sometimes it actually is HCM. Or it can look like amyloid, and it is amyloid. So that differential diagnosis becomes so important, which is why...
Someone phoning in to complain about HFpEF.
I'm getting yelled at to go to my next meeting, and I'm not going to go there yet. So This is
what I would say is, HFpEF is very simple. You have heart failure with a normal ejection fraction. Okay, so that level is very simple, but it's about the cardiomyopathy mindset. It's about the why question. And a lot of people who have heart failure symptoms or even objective measures of heart failure are obese. They have hypertension, so manage the hypertension, manage obesity. But the clinical point is, why is this person? So I'm going to target the obesity. I'm not going to invent a new drug in this person because I just need to lose weight. In other circumstances, it could be amyloid. In other circumstances, it could be a primary muscle disorder. So it's the same thing. It's saying, okay, we've got this scenario. Why is this person sitting here in front of me in the clinic? And as soon as you go down the why route, all sorts of possibilities open up.
And I look forward to the next conversation we have about that, because we've reached an hour and I've taken enough of your very valuable time, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And we will do this again. We're not going to wait as long next time. We'll do this in a couple months again. So I'll annoy you to get on your calendar. And there's some big stuff coming for 2025. And I'm really excited to see the Tenaya readout that's coming later this month. So I think we're going to see some encouraging information there. I encourage you all to stay tuned to episodes of Tales from the Heart and our other offerings to get some more information. And Perry, it's been good spending so much time with you in 2024. So that's one of my happy things of 2024. So I'm glad.
Let's plan the party for 2025.
I think we're going to Madrid, aren't we?
We are. So you're in Madrid, exactly.
You're in Madrid. And actually, I just got asked to do a patient meeting in Madrid ahead of ESC. So we'll be in touch about that. This is how I do my planning, people. Like, it comes up. I got to remember to tell them because I'll forget later. All right, Perry, thank you. Happy holidays. Have a very Merry Christmas. Happy, healthy New Year. And we'll talk to you in 2025.
I do. Merry Christmas.